Thanks everybody for coming out for the Free Enterprise Forum. My name is Daniel Bennett. I'm a research professor with the Baugh Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise. Our mission of the center is to be a national leader in the research and teaching of the importance of the free enterprise system for entrepreneurs, prosperity, and human flourishing. The center is funded by private philanthropy, so thanks to our generous donors for supporting us. This Free Enterprise Forum is part of our teaching mission, and the idea is to bring in nationally and internationally recognized thought leaders to talk about free enterprise. We do have a sign-in sheet going around if you want to sign up for our email list to stay updated on our events. Please give us your email address. I'm going to shut up in just shortly, but I want to introduce our guests today for the Free Enterprise Forum. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Munger, professor. Yeah. Very introverted. Dr. Munger is professor of political science at Duke University, where he also holds appointments in the economics and public policy departments, and is director of the philosophy, politics, and economics program there. He has published more than 200 articles and papers in journals and books, as well as 7 books, including his most recent book, Tomorrow 3.0, Transaction Cost and the Sharing Economy, which will be the topic of his discussion today. He has a PhD in economics from Washington University of St. Louis. He's also held appointments at the Federal Trade Commission, Dartmouth College, University of North Carolina, and University of Texas. In addition, he ran for governor of North Carolina in 2008. So if you want to know the results of that, you can Google him. He's won several teaching awards at Duke University. He's past president of the Public Choice Society and one of the former editor of the Public Choice Journal. Public Choice rejected my last paper I sent there, but he's no longer on the editorial board, so no harm, no foul. He's current editor of one of the current editors of the Independent Review, which has accepted one of my papers, so thank you, Mike. He's also a frequent guest and occasional guest host of the popular Econ Talk podcast, which I listened to on my way to work this morning and listen to every week. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Munger.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much. I always hope people don't mention the governor thing, but since he did, that explains that outburst there at the beginning. If you run for governor as a third-party candidate, you quickly discover that the only way you're going to get applause is to lead them yourself. So, as Daniel said, this work is from my most recent book. I'll also say a little bit at the end about some research I want to do to extend this. But let me start by saying basically the entire thesis of the book can be summarized pretty simply. There's a lot of things going on in what we call the sharing economy. But there's 2 separate interlocking phenomena, and the reason that it seems complicated is that some are due to one and some to the others. Now there's something we might call the middleman economy, where we sell reductions in transactions cost. And for the first time in human history, it's possible for entrepreneurs to sell reductions in transactions cost without really selling products. And the reason is the connection of 3 recent innovations. The first is handheld communication devices that old people call phones, but that young people have never used to make a phone call. They're used for something else. The second is a network of networks called the internet that connects all of those GPS and computing devices. And the third is a domain of permissionless innovation that we think of as app stores, but really are a way that someone in Somalia or a developing nation can write a piece of code that they can then sell on an internet store that will enable you and I, who live in the same town, to reduce the transactions cost of cooperating. We might otherwise never meet. So those 3 things, phones, the internet, and apps, are connecting to enable the selling of reductions in transactions cost. What that allows is the commodification of excess capacity. And if you remember only that one thing from this talk, please remember that. The key is the commodification of excess capacity. Now, since the beginning of time, commodification has been pretty destructive. The Industrial Revolution was destructive in large measure because, as Marx correctly noted, it was the commodification of labor. Commodification of labor meant that if I didn't have a money source of income, it would be very difficult for me to live in a village. I used to live in a village. I was able to get food. I was able to get clothing because I had a complex network of social relations that allowed me to do that. But when labor is commodified, it means that the money price of those things is raised to the point where I have to have some source of income, which meant that village relations were destroyed and people moved from villages to cities. And for decades after that, it was pretty bad. The Industrial Revolution was pretty destructive. And so when Marx and Engels wrote in 1848 the Communist Manifesto, the cities of Europe were on fire. If you look out the window, you think revolution is imminent. Well, the title of my book is Tomorrow 3.0. And the claim's a little bit grandiose, but it goes like this. The first great economic revolution was the Neolithic, or the transition from hunter-gatherer society to fixed agriculture. The second was the Industrial Revolution, or the commodification of labor and the exploitation and division of labor in factories. Both of those were extremely disruptive. I want to claim that we're on the verge of the third great economic revolution, which is the combination of these two factors. So, in political science, and we have at least one of my fellow political science professors here can attest to the truth of this statement. Science, in political science, is a 2x2 table. This is advanced science because we're going to have a 3x3 table where I take the rows and columns of the excess capacity and transactions cost and link them. Now, oh goodness. Well, let me just do it this way, if y'all can see this. So if we have high and relatively fixed transactions cost and high excess capacity, it's going to be difficult to write an app to be able to sell reductions in transactions cost and commodify that excess capacity. What sort of thing belongs there? My toothbrush. Now, I'm an assiduous brusher of teeth. Only my own teeth, nothing creepy, only my own teeth. But every morning I brush my teeth for 2 minutes. Every evening I brush my teeth for 2 minutes. So every day for 23 hours and 56 minutes, that toothbrush hangs there unused. It is unlikely we're going to be able to commodify that. So how about here, where we have high but reducible transactions cost and high excess capacity? Well, that's really the best value proposition. If I have a car in a few minutes and you need a ride, is there a way that we can exchange? Well, it's not all that easy. I'm ashamed to admit I have a black BMW 330. I'm just the sort of asshat you think I am. Swerving in and out of traffic, flashing my lights, because I'm important. I've got a big car. Well, most of the time that car sits in a special shrine at my house called a garage. But when you think of it, it is a kind of special shrine because when I approach it, the door opens because I have an electronic garage door opener. And that garage has an interior that is more secure, drier, better air conditioned than more than half of the people on Earth live. That my car lives in a better place than most people on Earth live. I was an administrator at Duke. I was chair of the department for 10 years, which means I have the parking space of God. Because if you're an administrator, what you really care, I mean, salary's fine. What you really want is a parking space. Well, my car is not in that parking space now, but it's sitting there open, waiting for me. So when we buy a consumer durable, we pay for it at least twice. We pay for it because the opportunity cost of the capital that's tied up in the thing, and then we pay the storage costs. I'm paying for garage space, I'm paying for parking space, and all of the excess capacity we have on the road should I decide to drive my car. That's pretty expensive. Now, all of you know that it is possible for us to commodify that excess capacity using an app called Uber. If I have a car in a few minutes, and you need a ride, we can find each other. And it's pretty hard otherwise. Suppose I pull up to a young woman who's walking in my black BMW. I roll down the window and I say, "Hey, you want a ride?" Well, like the police get called is a thing. So no, that's a bad idea, and I don't blame her. She doesn't trust me. There's no way for us to negotiate. But if we can solve the problems of transactions cost, and that's what Uber does, is it provides a way of selling reductions in transactions cost. It's a peer-to-peer transaction. The person with the car is selling a ride to the person who needs a ride. All that Uber is doing is mediating and acting as a seller of reductions in transactions cost. So Uber is not selling rides. What Uber is selling is reductions in transactions costs. But I should also note that up here is what you might call hipster heaven. Because my son, 29 years old, has lived in the Lower East Side of New York for the past 6 years while he was in grad school, and would often order really nice food from some artisanal bakery or cheese shop or something in Brooklyn, because you could find it online and you could get Uber to deliver it. Now, when I was growing up in rural Central Florida, we would get milk, eggs, bread, all sorts of things were delivered. It used to be common. But it's fairly uncommon now to have things delivered. But it's becoming much more common because if I can find it online and get it delivered inexpensively, I'm much more willing to pay for it. So here's the thing to recognize. For the consumer, all costs are transaction costs. For the consumer, all costs are transaction costs. So if I reduce the price, that makes the consumer more willing to buy it. If I reduce the inconvenience of buying it, that makes the consumer more willing to buy it. The difference is if I can sell that, I'm going to be able to sell, if I can sell the reduction in transactions cost, then you can get more peer-to-peer transactions. Well, having given that summary, now let me say something about three of the famous men of transactions costs. The first, on the left, was my dissertation advisor, Douglas North. Doug North won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1993. I defended my dissertation in 1984, so I had absolutely nothing to do with it, and yet I always bring it up. He won the Nobel Prize. Did I mention that? At my dissertation defense in 1984, Doug asked me a question, and I went to the blackboard because economists go to the blackboard and write equations when we don't know the answer. So I was writing on the blackboard, and after 2 or 3 minutes of painful silence, Doug raised his hand, and he said in a voice that you might use to address a well-loved but not very bright child, "Michael, the answer is transaction cost." The only answer I was looking for was transaction costs. And those of you who've read anything by Doug North know that it didn't matter what the question was, the answer is always transaction costs. And it may help you to know that for the rest of my talk today, the answer to pretty much every question is going to be transaction cost. Second man was another Nobel Prize winner, Ronald Coase, who asked a famous question, and it goes like this. Economists always talk about how great prices are. Well, if prices are so great, why are there firms? After all, prices are supposed to dictate what it is each of us do. We get signals about what to do from prices. If you were to ask someone who comes home from work in the United States and say, "What did prices tell you today?" they're going to think you're crazy because they work for a boss. Well, if you work for a boss, that's not even really a market. It's a small command economy. So Coase asked this really great question. If prices are so great, why are there firms? And they did rise up and speak as if with one voice and say transactions costs. Because the answer is, what is the cost at the margin of organizing one more transaction using the market or making it internally? The way that we usually talk about that in business schools is the make or buy decision. So if I'm an automobile company, I could have a mine where I get the iron that I use to make the steel to make the car. Okay. Do I have a farm where I grow the wheat to make the sandwiches in the employee cafeteria? I do not. Every company decides to make some things and buy some other things. If the transactions cost of reliably buying inputs on the market goes down, firm size goes down. If the cost of using the market goes down, firm size shrinks. So the size of firms is going to be in part determined by the cost of using the market, which is an alternative, which means that transactions cost determine that margin. Now, if Ronald Coase were alive today, he might ask a different question. Not, if prices are so great, why are there firms? He would ask, why do we own so many things instead of rent? And you know the answer is transactions cost. When you think about it, owning something is pretty crazy. And I think 50 years from now, people may well look back on the current era and say, isn't it remarkable that they had so many things that they then paid to keep under lock and key to prevent other people from using, when they could have been making money from sharing them? Why not share these things if you can share them reliably? Which brings me to the third man, the widget. Now, economists use a widget for an abstract thing that is complicated, hard to understand. It has no apparent purpose, which is why I call it a man. It's a good description of many men I know. But suppose, when we consider the widget, that person A owns it and will take any price greater than $1. B wants it and will pay any price less than $5. Now, usually in an economics class, we would say, what will happen now? And you'll say, well, A and B will negotiate an exchange. We don't really know the price. It'll be between $1 and $5. In the actual world, is any of that true? No. Why? Transaction costs. They can't find each other. They don't know the other person has a widget. They don't know what the two prices are. They may be at a great distance from each other. They may have different currencies. They may speak different languages, and they may not trust each other. So in the actual world, these unconsummated exchanges are everywhere. So one of the things that entrepreneurs do is discover these kinds of unconsummated exchanges. But suppose that instead of acting as a middleman and selling these exchanges, you could do something else. You could have an app that reduced the transactions cost of A and B finding and negotiating with each other. That would mean that peer-to-peer transactions would proliferate just because transactions costs fall. So let's suppose that transactions cost right now are 7. There are no transactions, and in fact, A and B have never met, they've never considered exchanging, and it's not a commodity. So we're starting way before an economic textbook would start. It's not a commodity yet. They've never thought of exchanging this. This is a suit that's hanging in my closet. It's not a commodity, it's a consumer durable. But suppose that there were some way that I could easily rent out a suit, or my wife could rent out one of her gowns. My wife has a boot annex, an entire extra closet with boots, many of which are in boxes that have never been opened, because she might want to wear them sometime. Well, she might be able to share those if she could reliably share them, but transactions costs are going to prevent that. But suppose an entrepreneur, we'll call her E, can write an app that will reduce transactions costs from $7 down to $1. Well, that would mean that B could pay $4, so he makes $1. The entrepreneur takes a $1 licensing fee, so she makes $1. A receives $2, and $1 is lost to transaction costs, because transactions costs play the same role in markets that friction plays in physics. It just burns off. It just burns off in the system. It disappears. Nobody gets it. It's just used up. The value is used up in the process. And the world is a better and more prosperous place with no increase in the number of widgets. With no increase in the number of widgets. So we have more than enough stuff. It's just in the wrong place. All over the world, stuff is in the wrong place. Those 3 things that I talked about, phones, the internet, and apps, can change that so that we can find ways to use the existing stuff that we already have more efficiently, partly by removing it, but also partly by sharing it. Well, I've talked about transactions cost quite a bit, but let me refine that by saying transactions cost have 3 aspects, and I made all 3 of them start with TR to make them easier to remember. First is triangulation. We have to be able to find each other and negotiate a price. The second is transfer. We need to be able to make a payment and deliver the product. And the third is trust. We have to believe that the other person's not going to rob you and is going to deliver the thing that I actually was promised. Now, how many of y'all, your family has a storage unit? A lot of people have storage units. Most of you have closets. Why? Transaction costs. The only reason is transactions cost. If you could easily get access to the stuff you want without having to pay to store it, you would. This is embarrassing. I have an outboard motor. I don't have a boat. It's a very nice outboard motor. It's probably worth $3,000. I've had it in a storage unit now for the past 6 years. I pay $175 a month for the storage unit, because it's a big storage unit. I have 2 hipster sons in their late 20s, and it's full of all their crap. So I pay $175 a month times 12 for 4 years. I should have set it on fire. I'd have been way better off if I had set the whole lot of it on fire. But it's worth something, and so I keep thinking, I'm going to use it, I'm going to sell it. Well, the reason that I now think of this as excess capacity, is that the opportunity cost is increased by the fact that transactions costs have been raised. So this is my theorem. The theorem in the paper could be stated this way. Excess capacity is variable with respect to the transactions cost of reassigning the use of the durable good. So what I see is storage of valuable items, but in fact, all of those things could be used by someone else. And when you think of it, most people in suburban neighborhoods have a lawnmower. And they use the lawnmower for 45 minutes once every 6 or 8 days. Sometimes in August, if you put too much fertilizer, every 5 days. And then you put it back in the shed. Why don't 3 or 4 of you share a better quality lawnmower? You could have a riding lawnmower. Well, the reason is transactions cost. We don't trust each other. We don't have any easy way of sharing that. Lowering transactions cost raises the opportunity cost of idle durable goods. It doesn't translate into excess capacity until we have a way of selling those reductions. The Austrian economics point here is that there's no such thing as capacity. Capacity is defined with respect to the transactions cost that creates some opportunity cost to not using the thing. So it's an institutional problem. Many of you, and I should note, this is Mark Andreessen, and it's not a retouched photograph. He actually is a human cone head. In November 2011, he wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal in which he said software is eating the world. And I put the text there. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint, but put the text there so it's easy for you to look up. But basically his claim is this. Software is to the service industry as robots and automation are to the production industry. Software is to the service industry as robots and automation are to the manufacturing industry, which means that software is a substitute for human beings in the service industry, and you can see this operating quite rapidly. Seattle, for reasons that may be plausible, recently raised its minimum wage to $15 an hour within the city to try to ensure a living wage for the people who live in Seattle. What do you not see if you go into a Starbucks, a McDonald's, almost any kind of fast food restaurant in Seattle? People. You don't see people except the other customers, because they just turn the cash register around. What used to happen is I would go in, I look at the board, I read some words, the person behind the counter would find the corresponding words on the keyboard. All you have to do is turn the cash register around. The words are on the keyboard. Find them there instead of on the board and press them yourself. 3 people lost their jobs. I travel a lot. I recently landed in Toledo, Ohio. I'm not going to talk about why. I was in Toledo. That's all you need to know. And we got there late because I was flying on Delta, delayed every last time always. And we got there about 11:45. By the time I got my bag and I'm ready to leave, I noticed that there was a guy over there by the door in the airport ready to turn the lights off. We were turning off the lights in the airport. We're done here. And I thought, how am I going to get my rental car? But then my phone buzzed, and I pull up my phone, and it says, your car is in C29, and here's your entry code, a 4-digit number. So I go to the box. There's a box. I punch in the number, my key comes out, I go to C29, I get in the car, and I drive off. There used to be a guy at the desk, there used to be someone handing out keys, and there used to be a security desk. 3 people lost their jobs to software. That's happening everywhere. Software is wiping out the service industry. And the reason is that it's much better for consumers. It's much cheaper. So we could probably go further than that. We could go, so when I travel, I never buy a car. I always rent one. And we're sort of used to that. But I have a laptop computer. I don't use it very often. All my files are in the cloud. Why don't I rent a laptop? And the answer is that at the airport, there is no laptopia. But there could be a, I'm not going to say it the same way, the laptopia. There could just be a place where I run my credit card and a laptop that's already configured to my preferences comes out. And then I use it for the trip. And when I end the trip, because I have a desktop at home and a desktop at my office, I don't need a laptop most of the time. I could just use that laptop for 2 or 3 days a month when I travel. And I bet within 10 years that's going to happen, where there's no reason to own a computer because all of the files and information you need are on the cloud and it's connected via the internet. Idala. Do you ever hitchhike? You hitchhike? And how does it go? I was impressed for a moment. I mean, it's weird to call on somebody, I'm sorry. So you generally don't hitchhike. You don't get out by the road and put your thumb out, and why not? Anybody want to help? The answer is why can't I get through to you people? The answer is transaction cost. So yes, you don't trust people. It's hard to find someone who's going to the same place. It's hard to negotiate a price. It's supposed to be for free. That's kind of weird. Has anybody ever used BlaBlaCar? I spend a lot of time in Central Europe. If I were asking that question in Central Europe, Czech Republic, Romania, Slovakia, Poland, half the audience would have used BlaBlaCar. BlaBlaCar is hitchhiking. Because if you go out to I-35 and you look at the trucks, almost all of them have an empty passenger seat. That's just excess capacity. Now, it's creepy for a truck driver to pull over and ask someone if they want to ride because you don't know if you're going to the same place. But suppose that you had an app called BlaBlaCar that gives you 4 pieces of information. First, where are you now? Second, where do you want to go? Third, what time? And 4, how much do you want to talk? Blah means I don't like other people very much. Blah, blah means, according to the software, enjoys a natter. Blah, blah, blah means rarely pauses even for breath. Just talk, 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 talk. So if you live in Brno and you want to go to Prague, it's an hour and a half by train and it's the equivalent of $80. You can get a truck to pick you up at your house, take you to your destination for $10 at the time you want to go. So you're just selling excess capacity. And it's not like Uber. Uber, that car would not be going unless you had this contract. But BlaBlaCar, this is unused capacity that's going along the interstate. So BlaBlaCar is hitchhiking, and it's a big competitor for trains or other kinds of long-haul mass transit. I put this up because this is the English version of BlaBlaCar. A little bit too happy, a little too hipstery, but okay. Anybody ever use SpinLister? A lot of students at Duke don't live in Durham. In fact, more than half of the students at Duke don't live in the United States, which is pretty remarkable. Many of them have bicycles. When they leave for the summer, they need to pay to store their bicycle, and it usually costs $20 a month to store their bicycle. What price would they be willing to take to rent out their bicycle instead? Suppose you could solve the 3 problems of triangulation, transfer, and trust. Well, $2. If I could rent my bike out for $2 a month, I make $6, I save $60 on the storage costs I don't incur, and it's a bike. It's returned in good shape, and I have insurance because of the software. So Spinlister is renting out things that you can share instead of store. More than a few of you may have, and this is usually a dad thing, it's the result of testosterone poisoning. Many of you may have a recreational vehicle in your driveway that dad thinks, this is going to be fun, it'll be great, we'll use it all the time. And then you don't really use it very often. But you could have an even more expensive, nicer one if you could rent it out for 1 month every summer, and if you could do it reliably. Now, it's a hassle to do it, but suppose that there was software called, in this case, Outdoorsy, that solved the problem of triangulation. You find someone who wants to rent it, transfer, it tells them how to come pick it up, and it makes the payment via credit card. And trust, if it's broken, the insurance pays for it. Well, if you could solve those 3 problems, we could make much better use of the recreational equipment that we already have. Now, one of the things you pretty quickly learn as an economics professor, and I dare say probably a business professor generally, the difference between a professor and an entrepreneur is about 3 years. That is, anything I thought of, an entrepreneur thought of 3 years ago. So I have these great ideas sometimes. And I was in Australia, and I was going to give a talk at the Cabinet Minister's office, which is basically their big regulatory office, and I was late. So I pulled out my phone and I'm going to use Uber. But there was a surge on Uber, so the price was 3 times the normal price. But the car was only 3 minutes away. And I thought, oh man, that's really expensive. So I go to one of the other ride-sharing services, and they didn't have a surge. The price was normal, but it was a 10-minute wait. Well, it means I had to go back and forth between those 2 software. And I said, what about Darwin? Do you remember the Star of Bethlehem orchid? Well, the Star of Bethlehem orchid famously had these 11-inch long petals, at the bottom of which is nectar. Now, nectar is expensive for the plant to make. It means that what the plant is doing is specializing in a particular creature that will pollinate this orchid, but it has to have an 11-inch long tongue. Now, no one had ever seen a moth with an 11-inch long tongue, but Charles Darwin said, aha, I can predict there must be a moth with an 11-inch long tongue. Voila. Turns out that it was true. So I made a kind of Darwinian prediction. I noticed the absence of something and said, this must exist. Let me ask a different question. What does orbit sell? Careful? Careful? It's a trick question. It sells reductions in transactions costs to websites that sell reductions in transactions costs. Orbitz is a meta transactions cost seller, because I can go to the hotel and they're selling reductions in transactions cost on their website. I can go look at an airline and they're selling reductions in transactions cost on their website. Orbitz curates that. I thought there should be an Orbitz, but for ride shares. I shouldn't have to go look at Uber and then go look at Lyft. There should be something that tells me all the prices and waiting times. And 10 years ago, I would have said, I'm a genius, I'm going to start raising capital. Now I know some entrepreneur thought of it 3 years ago. So, Go A to B and Fair Estimate already do those things. So there are apps that curate exactly ride-sharing services. And so Go A to B evolved into Fair Compare. So if you actually want to look up the current version of it, it's Fair Compare. And they have, I made the mistake, I almost got in a fight, of saying that they have it in Russia. And it turns out that this is Ukrainian, so I'm really sorry. It's Ukrainian, it's not Russian. And for Ukrainians and Russians, that matters a great deal. But the point is, all over the world, people are using rideshare services, and then they're going the next step, where someone somewhere wrote an app that basically is Orbitz, but for rideshares. So, let me tell a story, show a video, and then sum up. So I have talked a fair amount about Uber. I assume most of you have used Uber. Does Waco have Uber? So Austin for a while didn't, and it had some other ride shares. I use Uber 8 or 10 times a week. And when I go to Austin, it was interesting to use the other it's back in Austin. Is Uber a regulatory problem? Is Uber a regulatory problem? Might it present some regulatory problems for the government? Well, by analogy, let me say, I have 35 acres of forest land south of Pittsburgh, North Carolina. In most audiences, I would say this is because I want to sell the timber. That's partly true, but I actually mostly have it because I want to kill things. There's a lot of deer and turkey, and they're delicious. So I use it for hunting, and we also are trying to harvest the trees sustainably. So I have a forester that helps manage the trees. We're only taking a few for pulp, and we want to make sure that it's a sustainable habitat. So suppose that I go down there, and I'm walking on my land, and I hear, not far away, bum, 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 bum. It's a chainsaw. I promise I won't do that again. It actually hurt my throat. I actually had an elderly professor once in the front row who was sound asleep, who, when I did that, threw his toupee 2 rows back. Because he was going, whoo! I hear chainsaws, and I'm shocked. And I think, why do I hear chainsaws on my land? So I walk over there, and I see 3 guys with chainsaws and 2 with forklifts that are putting my trees on a truck. And I, being Southern and polite, say, hey, what are y'all doing? And they say, oh, you're probably the owner. Yeah, I bet you don't understand markets. Markets are about consumer sovereignty. There's constant competition in a creative destruction setting to try to provide products to consumers at the lowest cost. We have discovered that if we don't have to pay taxes, we don't have to do fertilizer, any of the things that owners have to do, we can provide forest products to consumers at much lower prices. And I say, just a minute, 911. And men with guns come, not my sons, though they would, but the Chatham County Sheriff with guns, big guns. And the reason is that I have a piece of paper called a title. And a title does 2 things. First, it says, I can use this. Second, it says, you can't. And if you do without my permission, men with guns will come. Even crazy libertarians like me think that's a pretty essential function of the state, is the protection of private property rights. So, most people probably think that's all right. Now, suppose I go to New York, and I'm about to get into a yellow taxi, and then I say, oh, no, I'm not going to do this. And I pull up my phone, and I get an Uber, and the Uber comes up, and the guy in the yellow taxi says, hey, what are y'all doing? And I say, oh, you're probably a taxi driver. Well, you don't understand markets. Because markets are about consumer sovereignty. And really, what Uber has discovered is that they can provide ride services at much lower cost if they don't have to pay taxes or insurance or any of the things that you people have to pay. He says, just a minute, 911, and nothing happens. The police say, there's an Uber? Really? Don't call me again. What's the difference? Remember that the taxi driver on Manhattan paid $800,000 for a medallion. And the paperwork that comes with the medallion says 2 things. First, you can drive a taxi in Lower Manhattan. Second, nobody else can. If they don't have a medallion, they can't drive in it. So a problem with this seems to be that many people on the libertarian or pro-market side that are really in favor of the sharing economy are pretty quick to dismiss the good faith promises that yellow taxi drivers made. The state said, you can't drive unless you pay $800,000. They said, here you go. The state took the money and then used it for something else. And now they say, you know, I don't know what we were thinking, never mind. That's not a good thing, that the state can just break its promise whenever a majority wants to. Now, that's one difficulty. Here's another. Do you know where the word sabotage comes from? It's an interesting story. In the 18th century, during the earliest part of the Industrial Revolution, new innovations dramatically increased the productivity of factories. Power looms were 100 times more productive than the traditional hand looms. Consumers were able to afford clothing and other necessities at lower prices than ever before. But new technologies often have a downside. In France and Belgium, the hand loom workers making traditional textiles opposed the new power looms, which would destroy their jobs. When they recognized the threat, they took action. They used hammers and clubs to break the power looms. Some of these workers wore rough wooden clogs called sabots. They would sneak in and throw their wooden shoes into the new machinery, breaking the fragile gears and shutting down the production lines. The sabot attacks became known as sabotage. And these vandals, the first saboteurs. Of course, in the long run, it didn't do much good. Power looms didn't go away, and even more automated processes of weaving and making textiles became standard. The advantages to consumers were so large that even widespread sabotage by disgruntled weavers couldn't hold back progress forever. We see the same thing happening in France today. Disgruntled taxi drivers in Paris are rioting against Uber, another innovation that's threatening livelihoods. And in a way, who can blame them? They're worried about losing their jobs and providing for their families. Nevertheless, the efforts of these taxi drivers will fail, just like the weavers, and for the same reasons. The innovations they're protesting are hugely beneficial for the average person and bring prosperity to whole communities. But there is one way taxi drivers could throw a clog into the gears of progress, and that's regulation. Regulations can sabotage progress more effectively than the hand loom workers ever could. Cities all over the world are implementing policies that outlaw innovations like Uber software. In my hometown of Raleigh, North Carolina, the city government actually made it illegal for Uber drivers to pick up or drop off passengers at the airport. Now, I'm paying higher prices and waiting longer whenever I want to travel. And if more cities are successful in clamping down on Uber, soon you and your friends will have the same problem. And it's not just Uber. We're on the brink of revolutionary changes that could drastically improve our lives. But these advances are constantly threatened by regulation. Maybe it's the regulations that need to be sabotaged. I wonder where I could get some of those wooden shoes. So, I've raised two conflicting concerns. One is that maybe we need more regulation. On the other hand, the form that the regulation may take will be to protect the sort of legacy industries, not necessarily to benefit consumers. So, Raleigh has since lifted the ban on Uber, but a number of cities, including Paris, have very seriously either argued about or adopted the following regulation. Uber is prohibited from picking up anyone for 30 minutes after a call because the taxis suck so hard that they want to make the playing field fair. Well, that doesn't benefit anyone. So that's not protecting something like insurance. Of course, Uber should have to have insurance. Regulation, licensing, that should be a level playing field. But if it's just because the taxis can't get their act together and pick you up for 30 minutes, that's a much less persuasive argument. Let competition take care of that. Well, to close, I want to leave you with a thought you may not have thought of. Amazon. What does Amazon sell? 20 years ago, we would have said books. Now, before you heard this lecture, you might have said lots of stuff, but you now know the answer is reductions in transactions cost. So Amazon is what's called a platform. A platform is anything that simultaneously does all three of the things I talked about: triangulation, transfer, and trust. Which means that now Amazon makes almost all of its money from AWS, Amazon Web Services. What that means is that if I'm a third-party vendor, I can just get AWS. Amazon will run my website. They'll clear all my transactions. They'll run my transportation and delivery, and they'll take care of returns. All I can do is concentrate on just having this one product. Well, the result is that Amazon now operates a wide variety of different activities, some of them even services. Let me ask this. What does Uber sell? Since Uber sells reductions in transactions cost, and they include triangulation, transfer, and trust, Uber probably is not going to sell ride shares any more than Amazon sells books. Suppose there's, I should note, there's 110 million power drills in the United States. Most of you all probably have a power drill at home. I have 4 because of transactions costs. If you rank the 110 million power drills from most used to least used, and you look at the 55th millionth, that is, you look at the median one, what is the total lifetime use? 30 minutes. 30 minutes total lifetime use. Because most of the time I'll get a drill, I'll make a couple holes in the wall because my wife wants to hang a picture and she'll say, not that wall. And I dig! So I'll put 2 holes in the other wall because you think that looks better now. Suppose that instead of owning a power drill, I could pull out my phone, go to Uber, scroll down to Power Tools, scroll down to Drills, punch it, and then in a few minutes, my phone buzzes because there's a smart pod in front of my house. A power drill has been delivered there by a driverless Uber car, and this Uber car is constantly moving around making deliveries, just moving things from one place to another. It doesn't know what they are, and it doesn't need to, because the software takes care of all of that. What path will the Uber car take? No one knows, because the software will solve the traveling salesman problem. This is not a very difficult problem for software to solve. I go out, I get the drill, I make the 2 holes, I put the drill back in the smart pod. The smart pod tells some other Uber driver to pick it up, and it goes to the next delivery. This is a drill that is a commercial quality drill, better than the one that I'm likely to own myself. It means that instead of having 110 million power drills in the United States, we can probably get by with something like 10 million. Which means that Uber is not a threat to taxis. Uber is a threat to Amazon. The big contest is between Uber and Amazon, the 2 platforms, because Uber specializes in rental deliveries. It can deliver services, you can get doctors. If you just look for Uber but for kittens, there's a lot of places that will deliver a comfort kitten to you. You can get doctors, you can get food, you can get power tools. So there's nothing special about the rideshare part of this. Uber is going to be fighting with Amazon 10 years from now. That's the colossal fight, because they're platforms. Once you have a way to sell reductions in transactions cost, it doesn't matter what the thing you're selling is. This is going to have 2 effects. One is a dramatic reduction in price, because we'll be able to rent rather than own, and we'll need far less storage. Second, a dramatic reduction in wages, because far fewer people will be employed in service or production industries. The 2 effects will net out in ways that are hard to predict. Economists have a concept for this called real wage. The real wage is the nominal wage divided by the price level. The question is, what's going to happen to the real wage for most people? For many people, prices are going to fall by more than their wages. That's great. For some people, it won't matter how low prices fall if they don't have any job at all. So my 2 questions for you is, how can you position yourselves to take advantage of the fact that this revolution that you can't stop and didn't give your permission for is happening underneath your feet? I'm old, I'm a tenured professor. I'm completely insulated from all of the effects that I'm talking about. You're not. So how can you position yourselves? The second, and in some ways larger question, is how can society try to account for and mitigate the damaging effects to people who, through no fault of their own, are going to be subject to catastrophic, wrenching change as a product of the 3rd great economic revolution. Thank you for listening.
So if anybody has questions, raise your hand and I'll bring this mic around that's working now. Peter?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about this third revolution is the way that it undoes some of the changes in previous revolutions. So, over the last 150 years, let's say, in more prosperous countries, we've moved from systems with less sharing to systems with kind of more independence and autonomy. So we used to travel by bus and train, and people lived in tenement blocks and so forth. As people became wealthier, they switched to private vehicles and standalone houses because they preferred some measure of control. So the question I'm getting at is, could you talk a little bit about the potential limits to sharing of resources that arise from our desire to be able to maintain control in unanticipated circumstances, or to be able to make things happen in a way that we couldn't contract for in advance through some kind of platform or sharing technology?
I think notions of social status and prestige are largely socially constructed. And so it is true that, have you ever used Airbnb? You've used Airbnb, but you don't hitchhike. You'll stay in an apartment and you know that somebody else has the key. That's fine. Well, 10 years ago, when people first heard about Airbnb, they said, no way, that's crazy. I almost never stay in a hotel now. I always stay in Airbnb. I very quickly got used to the idea that I would just as soon stay in somebody else's place rather than a hotel, which is sort of antiseptically anonymous. It's interesting that it's somebody else's place. It has idiosyncratic features. So I think it's true that we're always going to have status goods that are, I can get them, you can't have them, it means that I'm better than you in some way. That's going to be important. I don't think that it's necessarily true that they have to be McMansions with 4-car garages. Because many young people, let me put it this way, if you go to my Facebook page, you see pictures of my house and my pathetic car. If you go to see my son's Facebook page, you see him hang gliding in Nepal. Young people are trying to collect experiences, and they don't want to be tied down. They don't want to have a bunch of stuff that I wanted to have. So I think it's partly in reaction to what many people see as an excessive emphasis on sort of material belongings that keeps people from being able to do things. So I think that's an open question about what the socially constructed part, I think that's going to be an open question. What I think is interesting and important is people were able to move out to the suburbs because we had a set of social policies that facilitated that. We built a bunch of roads, we had malls, we had big shopping centers with big parking. So San Francisco, Boston, New York, a number of cities now are really running into problems because they have zoning laws that say any new housing, if you build a new housing development, it has to have 1.7 parking spaces per new unit. Well, that's a really big block. Once we get over the need for parking spaces, we can have much cheaper housing, which means that once you're not driving, there'll be a big benefit to re-urbanizing. So I expect the consequence of this to be a reversal, exactly a reversal of the suburbanization to a re-urbanization where people can walk around because there's a lot lower transaction costs. Many people just don't want to have to sit in traffic. And actually, you see that happening. Brooklyn, New York, many of the boroughs of New York, many young people are now moving in. And prices are skyrocketing. A parking space in New York City recently sold for $1 million. Now, it was a good parking space. It was underground, and it had a light and security. But still, $1 million for a parking space. We don't need parking spaces. We don't need closets. We don't need garages. We can make much better use of the space that we already have if we can use that stuff more intensively. So I'm probably not going to rent out my jeans. Maybe I'm not going to rent out my shoes. But there's a company called Rent the Runway. Has anybody used Rent the Runway? Rent the Runway means that you can have 3 items. a designer gown that you could never afford to own, a purse, and matching shoes. And it's like Netflix. You can have those three things and you turn them in, you can get 3 more. So you can have a new outfit every week. And you have a laser app that allows you to take measurements that are extremely accurate. And they send you a gown that exactly fits you. And so your closet is not cluttered up with all of this stuff you don't wear very much, and you have stuff that's much nicer than you would normally wear. If you're gonna wear a nice gown, you're only gonna wear it once anyway. So being able to rent those things is a huge advantage. So I agree, in my drill example, I intentionally went a bit too far. It's a drill joke. I intentionally went a bit too far. It's actually hard to imagine. That's not expensive enough. But designer gowns, those are expensive enough to make renting them make sense. So the 2 parts of the answer is, we're already seeing it on a lot of expensive stuff, and we're going to see a reduction in transactions cost. I agree that status goods will always be important, but the nature of those will change. He has a follow-up.
Yeah, I take the point. I really didn't have in mind the status goods aspect more as the kind of, sort of autonomy and control aspect. Mm-hmm. For example,
but she stays in an Airbnb. Miss No Hitchhike Girl will stay in an Airbnb.
It may be a question of the degree to which transaction costs can be reduced. Mm-hmm. So to use a ride-sharing example, I imagine a lot of other people in the room are the same as me. If I'm going to fly out of DFW, right, I can take the commuter hop on American Airlines. I can use one of the shuttle companies in town, or I can drive myself. I most often drive, even fully cognizant of the fact that that's inefficient from the point of view of our conversation today, but because there isn't a sharing service that meets my needs to the extent that it has the required amount of flexibility. So if I know I want to leave my house at this time, I want to go straight to the airport and arrive at that time, I can imagine a ride-sharing service that will meet my needs. But I don't know exactly what time I want to leave. I may want to stop on the way and get something to eat. I may not. I may need to use the restroom. Having a car that I control allows me to respond to uncertainty and to engage in a certain amount of serendipitous behavior that is hard to imagine unless the sharing applications are so sophisticated that moment by moment I can get exactly the resource that I want to do exactly the thing I want at that time.
I have 2 responses, one flippant and one serious. The flippant one is that presumably you're not raising Waco as an example of a highly urbanized area. It has to be a highly urbanized area for this really to work. That was the flippant one. The serious one is, and this is an entrepreneurship setting, the thing to remember is any problem old people like me can think of is actually a profit opportunity for some entrepreneur. If you can solve that problem, you can make money from solving it. You can sell reductions in transactions cost. So I agree, I don't know how to do it. But that's the value proposition, is figuring out how to make that more valuable. This is a little bit too far. I drove down here from the airport yesterday. It was terrible. I was in traffic a lot. It would have been very easy for me to have gotten some work done instead if it's an autonomous car. All it has to be is an autonomous car. And then I don't need to be able to have my car if I can immediately get another identical one. So the particular genius of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange was the commodification of grain. So before about 1880, if you sold grain, there was a bag of grain with your name on it. And you put it on a train and you hope to be able to sell it in New York. But it's a bag of grain with your name on it. You have to take care of it. You had to pay for transport. It was an enormously big hassle. What the Chicago Mercantile Exchange recognized was, we need to commodify this. So we have these giant silos. So you pull up the train full of grain, you dump it in, and then you get a piece of paper that says you have 2 tons of grain. Now you can take that 2 tons of grain and you can put it in the bank, and 2 years later you can say, I want my 2 tons of grain, and get it out. So if cars were like that, if you call a driverless car, it drives you to the airport, and you wanted to stop at Taco Bell, because I know that's your favorite. You want to stop at the Taco Bell on the way back, you just tell it, pull over. And you're in the back typing. So and it doesn't take any, you don't need to have control of the car if you had immediate access to a driverless car you don't have to wait for. There's a big line of them. So that's what I foresee as being the answer, even in not very urban areas, is why you have a garage and you have to pay for a parking space and you pay for this car that you don't use that much. If all you did was pay for the rental value of it, then, but you're right, you're absolutely right, it's inconvenient. So someone in this room might be the entrepreneur that figures out the way to solve that problem. Anything that you can think of that's a problem is actually a profit opportunity.
Russ? So just want to note that Professor Munger doesn't want us to own cars, doesn't want us to own houses, but there is an opportunity to own his book, which, because transactions costs are so high, maybe we can't rent it at the moment, but if you would like to get a copy, it's available in the back, and I'm sure he'd be happy to sign it for you.
I'd be very happy to sign it after you buy it.
First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. My question is about, well, you've talked about ownership and rentership and the changing dynamics there. So we're kind of talking about consumption in the sharing economy, but I'm curious about your thoughts about the producer side of things, because Amazon and Uber, not really the manufacturers. So what happens to DeWalt or the maker of that 3D printer or water jet when you can actually start selling designs to other middlemen who might do the production, or you might send it to someone who owns it themselves and bypass some of the things that are typically in that supply chain that become part of the cost of producing and distributing those products. So thoughts on production in the sharing economy?
Catastrophe. Complete creative destruction, complete disruption. Once you can have 3D printers that can print 3D printers, then production is local. And I don't need any of those producers. So let's suppose we take just the drill example. Maybe DeWalt will survive because they already make relatively high quality drills. But they'll have to amp up, they'll still produce less, but they'll produce much higher quality drills. So the problem that we have with a lot of what we dispose of is we're trying to make things cheaper and lighter. If we just made them heavier and more durable, we could share them. And so the direction of development is going to change. And a lot of companies are not going to survive that. Capitalism doesn't care about companies. It cares about consumers. So the problem of creative destruction is going to be a catastrophe for a whole lot of companies that are not nimble enough to figure this out. It's terrible. This has to be the last question.
Now there's pressure. I was just going to comment that I think you're underestimating the ability of people to have heterogeneous demand. So the immediate thing that comes to mind when you say producers is how McDonald's and Chick-fil-A are jumping on DoorDash or Uber Eats. And so, I mean, there is something that, you know, maybe I really want, I don't know, a bright pink drill or something. And so then you'll get a lot of customization of these things as well. So.
Well, I mean, you've made 2 points, and they're both right. I'm intentionally taking an extremely pessimistic view. That's kind of the worst case. I think that it is likely that the companies that make things to share will have some trouble. From the producer side, suppose I'm a contractor, and so I need all my stuff, and it needs to work. But I go home at night, and I go on vacation. So my son, who lives in the Lower East Side of New York, whenever he goes to a conference, he rents out his apartment on Airbnb and makes quite a bit of money. So he's a producer because he has a rental, but he then rents it out further. If I'm a contractor, when I get home at night, I put all my tools in the SmartPod, and people can rent it overnight. If they break, they get returned. Now we have to solve that problem of being low transactions costs, but if we can, okay. The optimistic side is there could be a flourishing of human creativity, the likes of which we have rarely seen. There are right now bearded young men and bearded young women likely in Brooklyn, New York, that are making designer pickles. It's $17 for a small jar of maple, bacon, garlic pickles, and you can get them delivered. And they're making quite a good margin on these, but they need enough volume to be able to pay for that real estate in Brooklyn. But if they have drivers, you have a website, I've ordered these pickles. They're really good. So for a treat, the cheese, beer, all sorts of local, artisanally made things. So this is the locavore's best dream. Those things are selling for full price because they're consumer goods. We're not sharing them. That's just the reduction in transactions cost side. So if the reduction in transactions cost comes to dominate, sharing is important, but it's not the main value proposition. It may be that we'll see a flourishing, everybody will be some kind of producer. You'll go to my LinkedIn page, and I'll have a brand name, and I work on gigs. So you actually see this already, and some of you probably know this. In Hollywood, there's 172 different disciplines in making a movie, and they're highly specialized, and people have reputations for being the gaffer, the key grip, the best boy, which is, I'm not going to say anymore. There's a bunch of different jobs that go in movies. So if I want to make a movie, I will hire all of them on LinkedIn. On day one, they all know their jobs. This thing articulates like a team. We work together for 3 months to make the movie, and then we're done. It's not a firm. It's a temporary team. So then somebody else will put together a different proper subset plus some more of those. So you work 2 of these gigs a year. Maybe you work 6 months a year. The rest of the time, you don't have to work. So there's all sorts of ways that this might actually be an improvement. John Maynard Keynes predicted a 2-day work week in 1929. We might get it in 2029.